The first rays of dawn on June 6, 1944, pierced through the English Channel's morning mist, like daggers cutting through the veil of Nazi tyranny that had shrouded Europe for years. Allied ships stretched across the horizon as far as the eye could see, their steel hulls carrying the hopes of millions and the weight of freedom itself. General Dwight David Eisenhower stood aboard his command vessel, his weathered face etched with the gravity of the moment. The supreme Allied commander knew that this single day would determine whether the continent would remain enslaved under Adolf Hitler's iron fist or break free from the chains of oppression. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, was about to commence. The German defenders along the Atlantic Wall had no idea what was coming. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months fortifying the French coastline, transforming beaches into deadly killing fields, with concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and millions of mines. Yet even the desert foxes, meticulous preparations could not have anticipated the sheer magnitude of the Allied assault force. Approaching through the pre-dawn darkness, across the Channel, 156,000 Allied soldiers prepared for what many believed would be their final morning. American, British, Canadian, French, Polish, and countless other nationalities united under one banner of liberation. Private First Class John Mitchell from Ohio clutched his rifle with trembling hands, knowing that in mere hours he would either be advancing through French soil or lying beneath it. According to wartime records from the National Archives, the invasion fleet comprised over 5,000 vessels of every conceivable type. Battleships and destroyers provided massive firepower, while landing craft carried the precious human cargo that would storm the beaches. Above them, 13,000 aircraft dominated the skies, their engines creating a thunderous symphony of approaching freedom. The coastal defenses of Normandy appeared impregnable from the sea. Concrete casements housing deadly 88mm guns commanded sweeping fields of fire. Across the beaches, behind them, machine gun nests and mortar positions created interlocking zones of death. German General Friedrich Dahlmann's 7th Army had transformed this stretch of French coastline into what they believed was an impenetrable fortress. But the Allies possessed something the Germans lacked: the unbreakable will of free peoples, fighting for their very existence. French resistance fighters had spent years gathering intelligence on German positions, risking torture and death to provide crucial information to the liberation forces. Their sacrifice would prove invaluable in the coming hours. As the invasion fleet drew closer to the Norman shores, the destiny of an entire continent hung in the balance. The beaches of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword would soon witness scenes of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. Young men who had never seen combat would become legends, while seasoned veterans would face their greatest test. The operation represented far more than a military maneuver. It embodied the collective determination of democratic nations to restore freedom to occupied Europe. Mothers, wives, and children across America and Britain had sent their sons and husbands into this maelstrom, trusting that their sacrifice would liberate millions from Nazi brutality. In these final moments before the assault began, time seemed suspended between tyranny and freedom, between despair and hope, between the darkness of occupation and the dawn of liberation that was about to break across the beaches of Normandy. The naval bombardment began at 5:30 in the morning, transforming the Norman coastline into a hellscape of fire and steel. Battleships like the USS Texas and HMS Warspite unleashed their massive guns, each shell screaming through the air with the voice of democracy itself. The earth trembled along the French coast as tons of high-explosive ordnance pulverized German fortifications that had taken years to construct. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, commander of the Allied naval forces, had orchestrated this maritime symphony of destruction with meticulous precision. Every gun, every ship, every shell had been calculated to maximize the devastating impact on enemy positions, while clearing the way for the assault troops. The German defenders cowered in their bunkers as the very foundations of their Atlantic Wall shook beneath the relentless pounding. From his observation post overlooking Omaha Beach, German Lieutenant Heinrich Severloh watched in growing horror as the Allied armada materialized. From the morning haze, the young officer had been told repeatedly that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. Yet the sight before him suggested otherwise. Hundreds of landing craft were approaching through the surf, each one packed with allied soldiers determined to liberate his occupied homeland. The aerial assault had preceded the naval bombardment by hours. British Royal Air Force Lancasters and American flying fortresses had carpet-bombed German positions throughout the night, their payload of destruction intended to neutralize artillery positions and communication networks. Squadron leader James Morrison piloted his Spitfire through the pre-dawn darkness, knowing that his mission, to suppress enemy fighters, was crucial to the success of the entire operation. According to documented records from the Imperial War Museum, the air campaign involved over 11,000 sorties on D-Day alone. Fighter planes swept the skies clear of German aircraft, while medium bombers targeted specific tactical objectives. Transport aircraft dropped thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines, creating chaos and confusion in the German rear areas. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already been fighting for hours when the beach assault began. Major Richard Winters led his men of easy company through the Norman hedgerows, engaging German patrols and securing vital road junctions. These brave soldiers, scattered across the countryside by fierce anti-aircraft fire and navigation errors, improvised and adapted to accomplish their mission of disrupting German reinforcement efforts. French civilians caught in the crossfire faced an agonizing choice between safety and resistance. Marie Dubois, a young teacher from Caen, had spent the night hiding in her cellar as bombs fell around her neighborhood. Yet when she saw American paratroopers landing in nearby fields, she knew that liberation was finally at hand. Her courage in providing intelligence about German positions would prove invaluable to the advancing Allied forces. The German response was swift but disorganized. General Edgar Feuchtinger's 21st Panzer Division received conflicting orders about whether to counterattack the beaches or defend against the airborne landings. This confusion, deliberately fostered by months of Allied deception operations, would prove fatal to German defensive efforts. The Wehrmacht's rigid command structure, dependent on orders from higher headquarters, could not adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing situation. As the first landing craft approached the beaches, seasick soldiers prepared to leave their steel walls and face the deadly reception. Awaiting them on the sand, Sergeant William Thompson of the 1st Infantry Division checked his equipment one final time, knowing that his survival would depend on quick thinking and quicker reflexes. The boat's hull scraped against the sandy bottom of Omaha Beach, and the ramp dropped with a metallic clang that seemed to echo across eternity. The moment of truth had arrived. Democracy and tyranny would clash on the beaches of Normandy, with the fate of Western civilization hanging in the balance. The machine guns opened fire the instant the landing craft ramps dropped, turning the surf red with the blood of heroes. At Omaha Beach, German gunners in their concrete emplacements had perfect fields of fire across the killing ground below. American soldiers fell by the dozens as they struggled through the water, weighed down by waterlogged equipment and facing an enemy that had waited for years for this moment. Captain John Miller of the 2nd Ranger Battalion watched in horror as his men were cut down around him. The carefully planned assault was disintegrating into chaos as German mortars found their range, and machine gun bullets swept the beach like a deadly scythe. The sand that should have represented the first step toward liberation instead became a graveyard for America's finest young men. German machine gunner Klaus Weber felt no joy in the slaughter unfolding before his position. The 19-year-old conscript from Bavaria had never wanted this war, but orders were orders. His MG-42 chattered incessantly as he fired belt after belt of ammunition into the approaching Americans. Each muzzle flash brought death to enemy soldiers, but Weber knew that his own survival measured in minutes, not hours. The tide was rising, forcing the surviving assault troops to advance or drown. Technical Sergeant Frank Perigori of the 116th Infantry Regiment realized that staying on the beach meant certain death. Gathering a handful of men around him, he charged toward the bluffs overlooking the sand, screaming at the top of his lungs to overcome his own terror. His Medal of Honor citation would later record his extraordinary gallantry in leading this desperate assault. At Utah Beach, the situation was markedly different. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, had landed with the first wave despite being 57 years old and walking with a cane. When he discovered that the landing had occurred at the wrong location, he made the crucial decision that saved countless lives, declaring, "We'll start the war from right here." His leadership and courage inspired an entire division to push inland against lighter German resistance. Historical records from the United States Army Center of Military History document that the 4th Infantry Division at Utah Beach suffered only 197 casualties on D-Day, a remarkably low number compared to the carnage at Omaha. This stark contrast illustrated how battlefield conditions could vary dramatically even within the same operation. British forces at Gold Beach faced their own deadly challenges. The Hampshire Regiment encountered fierce resistance from German strongpoints that had survived the naval bombardment. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Kimmins led his men in a series of frontal assaults against concrete bunkers, knowing that each attack might be his last. The green fields of Normandy were being watered with English blood, but freedom's price had to be paid. Canadian troops storming Juno Beach demonstrated that courage knew no national boundaries. The Regina Rifles and Royal Winnipeg Rifles pushed inland with grim determination, clearing German positions house by house through the coastal villages. Major Lockie Fulton fell while leading his company against a particularly stubborn machine gun nest, his sacrifice emblematic of Canada's contribution to European liberation. French civilians watched the battle unfold from cellars and hiding places, their hearts torn between hope and terror. Madame Bouchard sheltered 3 wounded American soldiers in her farmhouse, risking execution if discovered by German patrols. Her quiet heroism represented the spirit of occupied Europe, where ordinary people performed extraordinary acts of resistance. As the day progressed, individual acts of courage began to tip the balance. Rangers scaled the impossible cliffs at Point du Hoc under withering fire to silence German artillery positions. Engineers blew gaps in the beach obstacles while under constant bombardment. Medics crawled through machine gun fire to treat wounded comrades, their Red Cross armbands providing no protection from German bullets, but marking them as angels of mercy to the men they served. The beaches of Normandy were proving that freedom's birth required the ultimate sacrifice. From those who cherished it most. By midday, the tide of battle was turning, but at a cost that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Colonel George Taylor's immortal words, "There are 2 kinds of people who are staying on this beach, those who are dead and those who are gonna die," galvanized the men of the 1st Infantry Division to push beyond the deadly sand and into the bocage country beyond. The German defenders were beginning to crack under the relentless pressure. Major Werner Pluskett, commanding artillery positions overlooking Omaha Beach, watched his carefully constructed defenses crumble as Allied naval gunfire found his concealed batteries. Each direct hit eliminated months of preparation and irreplaceable equipment that the Wehrmacht could no longer replace. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was fighting a different kind of battle in the Norman hedgerows. Separated from his unit during the night drop, he gathered stragglers from various units and launched single-handed assaults on German strongpoints around the village of Mesnil. His one-man war against an entire enemy garrison would later be recognized as one of the most extraordinary individual achievements in military history. The French resistance had been waiting for long years for this moment. Jacques Duclos, a railway worker from Bayeux, had spent the occupation memorizing German troop movements and supply schedules. When the invasion began, he led a team of saboteurs who destroyed critical rail lines, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. His knowledge of the local terrain proved invaluable to advancing Allied forces. German reinforcements were struggling to reach the battle zone due to 2 months of Allied bombing and resistance sabotage. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg's Panzer Group West faced impossible choices: commit armor piecemeal to shore up crumbling beach defenses or hold back for a coordinated counterattack that might never come. The rigid German command structure, so effective in the Blitzkrieg campaigns, was proving inadequate for defensive warfare against an enemy that controlled the seas and skies. According to declassified documents from the Central Intelligence Agency, German intelligence had completely failed to detect the scale and timing of Operation Overlord, the elaborate deception campaign including the fictitious First United States Army Group commanded by General George Patton, had convinced German high command that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. This strategic misdirection proved crucial in limiting German resistance on D-Day itself. The medical corps performed miracles under impossible conditions throughout that bloody day. Captain Eugene Rowe of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment crawled from foxhole to foxhole under sniper fire, administering morphine and bandages to wounded paratroopers. His quiet courage and professional skill saved dozens of lives during the chaotic hours following the airborne landings. British commandos were writing their own chapter of heroism at Sword Beach. Lord Lovat's 4th Commando Brigade fought through heavily defended Ouistreham to link up with paratroopers holding vital bridges over the Orne River. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Mills Roberts led his men in a series of vicious close-quarters battles that cleared German strongpoints one by one, each victory measured in yards gained at tremendous cost. As evening approached, the Allies had secured tenuous footholds on all 5 invasion beaches, but the price had been staggering. Thousands of young men lay dead or wounded in the Norman sand, their blood mingling with the soil of the continent they had died to liberate. Yet their sacrifice had created the cracks in Hitler's Atlantic Wall that would eventually bring down the entire Nazi Empire. The German defenders who survived the day's fighting knew that this was only the beginning. Wehrmacht Lieutenant Gustav Berger, retreating from his demolished bunker on Omaha Beach, realized that the war was effectively lost. The Allies had proven they could successfully invade Fortress Europe, and German resources were simply insufficient to throw them back into the sea. In hospitals, aid stations, and casualty collection points across southern England, the wounded were already arriving. Their stories of courage and sacrifice would inspire a generation. But the cost of freedom had been written in blood across the beaches of Normandy. The 72 hours following D-Day would prove as crucial as the initial landings themselves. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, racing back from his wife's birthday celebration in Germany, arrived to find his carefully constructed Atlantic Wall breached in multiple locations. The Desert Fox's legendary tactical genius faced its greatest challenge: how to contain an enemy beachhead that was expanding by the hour. Allied engineers worked round the clock to establish the artificial harbors that would sustain the liberation of Europe. The ingenious Mulberry harbors, towed across the English Channel in sections, were being assembled off the Norman coast despite continued German artillery fire. These floating piers would prove more valuable than any captured port, allowing the continuous flow of men and materials that would fuel the advance into occupied Europe. German General Friedrich Dahlmann's 7th Army was bleeding to death from 1,000 cuts. Every village, every crossroads, every hedgerow became a battleground as Allied forces pushed inland. The bocage country of Normandy, with its ancient stone walls and thick vegetation, favored the defenders, but German units were already showing signs of the attrition that would eventually destroy them. Private Eddie Slovic of the 109th Infantry Regiment faced a different kind of battle. As American forces consolidated their beachhead, the replacement soldier from Detroit had never wanted to be a hero, and the carnage around him filled him with paralyzing terror. His decision to desert would later make him the only American soldier executed for cowardice during World War II, a tragic reminder that not all men were capable of the extraordinary courage demanded by liberation. The Royal Air Force maintained air superiority over the battlefield through relentless effort and sacrifice. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson led his Canadian squadron in continuous patrols over the beachhead, engaging German fighters whenever they attempted to interfere with ground operations. His Spitfire's guns spoke with the voice of freedom, clearing the skies for the bombers and transport aircraft that sustained the Allied advance. French civilians emerged from their hiding places to witness scenes they had only dared dream about. For years, American soldiers sharing K-rations with hungry children, British medics treating wounded German prisoners with the same care they showed their own men, and Canadian engineers rebuilding bridges destroyed by German demolitions. Liberation was revealing the fundamental humanity that Nazi ideology had sought to destroy. Documentation from the British War Office reveals that logistical challenges nearly proved as dangerous as German resistance. During the critical first week, Ammunition shortages forced artillery units to ration shells while fuel shortages grounded aircraft needed for close air support. The magnificent improvisation of Allied supply officers kept the offensive moving when textbook procedures would have failed. General Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group faced the daunting task of expanding the narrow beachhead before German reinforcements could launch a coordinated counterattack. Monty's meticulous planning had gotten Allied forces ashore, but now battlefield improvisation would determine whether they could stay there. Every hour of delay allowed the Germans to strengthen their defensive positions and bring up reserves. German tank crews were discovering that their vaunted panzer divisions were ill-suited for defensive warfare in the bocage. Sergeant Heinrich Schulze's Panther tank bogged down in a Norman marsh while attempting to counterattack American positions, making his powerful vehicle a sitting target for Allied fighter bombers. The tactical mobility that had made German armor legendary during the Blitzkrieg campaigns became a liability in the confined terrain of Normandy. The German High Command was finally beginning to realize the magnitude of their strategic miscalculation. Adolf Hitler's insistence that Normandy was merely a feint, designed to draw attention from the real invasion at Calais, had prevented the deployment of adequate reserves to contain the Allied beachhead. By the time German intelligence confirmed that Operation Overlord was the main effort, it was too late to prevent Allied consolidation. As June 10th dawned over the Norman countryside, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Allied forces controlled nearly 100 square miles of French territory, with more troops and supplies landing every hour. The foothold of liberty was becoming the foundation for the liberation of an entire continent. The ancient city of Caen became the focal point of a titanic struggle that would determine the fate of the Normandy campaign. British General Bernard Montgomery's plan called for the capture of the strategic communications center on D-Day itself, but German resistance had proven far more tenacious than Allied intelligence had predicted. Now, 2 weeks into the campaign, Caen remained in enemy hands, its medieval streets turned into a fortress by determined Wehrmacht defenders. SS Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer's 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had rushed to Normandy. From its training grounds in Belgium, its ranks filled with 18 and 19-year-old volunteers who had grown up under Nazi indoctrination. These young fanatics fought with a desperation born of ideological fervor, making every building and every street corner a battleground. Their fanatical resistance would exact a terrible price from both sides. Canadian forces bore the brunt of the fighting around Caen, facing an enemy that showed no mercy to prisoners. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders discovered the mutilated bodies of their comrades, who had been captured during the initial advance, victims of SS brutality that violated every convention of warfare. This barbarity only strengthened Allied resolve to crush the Nazi regime completely. Major David Currie of the South Alberta Regiment embodied the spirit of Canadian determination. During the brutal fighting south of Caen, when his tank squadron was surrounded by superior German forces, he rallied his men for a desperate last stand that held vital ground until reinforcements arrived. His Victoria Cross citation would later record that his leadership under impossible circumstances saved hundreds of Canadian lives. The French civilian population of Caen endured unimaginable suffering. As their city became a battleground, Madame Claire Dumas sheltered 23 neighbors in her cellar as artillery shells destroyed the medieval cathedral above them. Her diary, discovered years later, provided a heartbreaking account of ordinary people caught between liberation and destruction. The price of freedom was being paid not only by soldiers, but by the very people they had come to liberate. Strategic bombing campaigns attempted to break German resistance through sheer destructive power, but often created more problems than they solved. Operation Charnwood, the massive bombing of Caen that preceded the British assault, reduced much of the city to rubble but failed to eliminate German defenders. The mountains of debris actually provided better defensive positions for SS troops, while blocked streets hindered Allied armor trying to advance through the devastation. According to records maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Canadian casualties during the fighting for Caen reached staggering proportions. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles lost over 60% of their strength in a single day's fighting. Their sacrifice measured in yards of rubble-strewn ground, Each street represented dozens of young lives cut short in the cause of liberation. American forces were simultaneously fighting their own desperate battle in the Bocage country. West of the beachhead, the 1st Infantry Division discovered that the ancient field boundaries of Normandy created natural fortresses that channeled attacks into deadly killing zones. Each hedgerow required individual assault tactics, making progress achingly slow and costly. General Omar Bradley's innovative solution to the Bocage problem came from an unlikely source. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron welded steel teeth from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks, creating the famous Rhino tanks that could crash through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. This battlefield modification, born of American ingenuity, would revolutionize the fighting in Normandy. German defenders were showing increasing signs of strain as the battle of attrition continued. Major Hans von Luck's tank battalion had been reduced to a handful of operational vehicles. While his infantry companies existed only on paper, the Wehrmacht's tactical excellence could not compensate for the material superiority that the Allies enjoyed in every category of warfare. The weather itself seemed to conspire against both sides during the crucial month of June. Violent storms battered the Normandy coast, wrecking one of the Prussia's Mulberry harbors and halting supply operations for days. German and Allied soldiers alike struggled through mud and rain that turned every movement into an ordeal. As July approached, the battle for Normandy was entering its decisive phase, with both sides committed to a struggle that could only end in total victory or complete defeat. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, shattered the German line with a violence that reshocked the world. General Omar Bradley's First Army had massed overwhelming firepower along a narrow front west of Saint-La, creating the conditions for the breakout that would liberate France. The preliminary bombardment involved over 1,500 heavy bombers dropping their deadly cargo on a rectangle of Norman countryside that measured only 2 miles by 1 mile. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein watched his Panzer Lehr division disintegrate under the crushing weight of Allied bombs. The veteran commander, who had served with distinction under Erwin Rommel in North Africa, later described the bombardment as hell on earth. Entire tank companies vanished in minutes as 1,000-pound bombs turned steel monsters into twisted scrap metal. The precision of American aerial bombardment had evolved far beyond anything seen earlier in the war. The breakthrough came with shocking suddenness after weeks of grinding attrition. Major General J. Lawton Collins' 7th Corps punched through the shattered German defenses like a knife through tissue paper. The Lightning Joe's aggressive tactics had been criticized as wasteful earlier in the campaign, but now his willingness to accept casualties was paying enormous dividends as American forces raced across the Norman countryside. General George Smith Patton's Third Army had been waiting in England for this moment, its existence concealed from German intelligence by an elaborate deception campaign. When Patton's armor finally entered the battle, it did so with characteristic fury. The 4th Armored Division advanced over 60 miles in the first 48 hours, leaving behind a trail of burning German vehicles and captured supply dumps. French resistance fighters emerged from hiding to assist the rapid Allied advance, their detailed knowledge of local terrain proving invaluable to American tank commanders. Pierre Mesmer, later to become Prime Minister of France, led a group of Maquis fighters who guided Sherman tanks around German roadblocks, their contribution to liberation extending far beyond their modest numbers. The German response was hampered by command confusion and communication breakdown. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge had replaced the wounded Rommel as Army Group B. Documented evidence from German military archives reveals the extent of Wehrmacht demoralization. During the Cobra breakthrough, entire regiments surrendered without firing a shot, while others simply dissolved as soldiers abandoned their positions to flee eastward. The myth of German military invincibility, carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda, was crumbling along with Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The liberation of French towns and villages created scenes of joy that contrasted sharply with the surrounding devastation. American soldiers were showered with flowers and wine as they rolled through communities that had endured for years of occupation. Technical Sergeant William Anderson of the 5th Armored Division later recalled, that French civilians often risked their lives to warn advancing Americans about German ambushes and minefields. British and Canadian forces launched their own breakthrough operation, codenamed Spring, designed to complement the American success. The operation failed to achieve its ambitious objectives, but succeeded in preventing German reinforcements from moving west to contain Patton's advance. The coordinated nature of Allied operations was finally paying dividends after weeks of seemingly unconnected attacks. The Falaise Pocket was beginning to form as German forces found themselves caught between American forces advancing from the west and British-Canadian forces attacking from the north. General Heinrich Eberbach's 5th Panzer Army faced the nightmare scenario of encirclement, with only narrow corridors remaining open for retreat toward the Seine River. SS General Joseph Sepp Dietrich's 1st SS Panzer Corps fought with desperate courage to keep these escape routes open, but Allied air power made daylight movement virtually impossible. Rocket-firing Typhoons of the Royal Air Force turned German supply columns into funeral pyres, while American thunderbolts strafed anything that moved on Norman roads. As August began, the Battle of Normandy was reaching its climax. The German 7th Army was on the verge of complete destruction, while Allied forces prepared for the final phase of the campaign that would close the Falaise Gap and trap the remnants of two enemy field armies. The Falaise Pocket became a cauldron of destruction where the German Army Group B met its inevitable doom. General Heinrich Eberbach's desperate attempts to extract his forces from the closing trap were foiled by relentless Allied pressure from all directions. Polish Armored Division Commander General Stanisław Maciek's tanks seized the high ground overlooking Falaise, while Canadian forces fought savage battles for every crossroads leading east toward Germany. The final phase of the encirclement battle tested the courage and endurance of all participants. Major David Currie's Canadian Tank Squadron held a vital road junction against repeated German breakout attempts, his Victoria Cross winning stand symbolizing the determination that had brought Allied forces from the beaches of Normandy to the verge of total victory. Every shell fired by his tanks closed the escape route for thousands of trapped German soldiers. French forces of the interior played a crucial role in the pursuit operations that followed the collapse of German resistance. Captain Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division raced toward Paris with an urgency born of 4 years of national humiliation. The liberation of the French capital would symbolize not just military victory, but the restoration of national honor that had been trampled underfoot since 1940. The human cost of the Normandy campaign was staggering for all participants. Allied forces had suffered over 100,000 casualties during the 77 days of fighting, while German losses exceeded 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Each name on the casualty lists represented a family destroyed, dreams unfulfilled, and potential unrealized. The price of freedom had been written in blood across the Norman countryside. Documentation from the German Federal Military Archives reveals the complete breakdown of Wehrmacht command and control. During the final phase of the battle, Field Marshal Walter Model rushed from the Eastern Front to replace von Kluge, arrived to find that most of his supposed divisions existed only on paper. The German military machine that had conquered most of Europe in 3 years had been ground to pieces in less than 3 months. The liberation of Paris on August 25th represented the symbolic culmination of Operation Overlord's success. General Charles de Gaulle's emotional return to the capital he had fled for years earlier marked the restoration of French sovereignty and the beginning of Nazi Germany's final collapse. The Arc de Triomphe, which had been defiled by German victory parades, once again stood as a monument to French liberty. American forces were already racing eastward toward the German frontier, their advance limited more by fuel shortages than enemy resistance. General George Patton's Third Army covered distances in days that had taken weeks to traverse. During the Bocage fighting, proof that German defensive capabilities had been shattered beyond repair. The ghost of the Wehrmacht continued to fight, but its substance had been destroyed in the killing fields of Normandy. Soviet forces were simultaneously crushing German Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, creating a two-front catastrophe that made German defeat inevitable. The coordination between East and West, while imperfect, had created strategic conditions that no amount of German tactical skill could overcome. Hitler's dream of European domination was collapsing under the weight of his own strategic miscalculations. The aftermath of the Normandy campaign would reshape the post-war world in ways that few participants could imagine. The successful invasion had demonstrated Anglo-American military superiority and ensured that Western Europe would be liberated by democratic forces rather than Soviet armies. The political implications would resonate through the remainder of the 20th century. As September dawned over the scarred Norman landscape, the Great Invasion had achieved objectives that seemed impossible just months earlier. Hitler's Atlantic Wall lay in ruins, his armies were in full retreat, and the liberation of Western Europe was assured. The immense operation that began on the beaches of Normandy had indeed freed a continent from tyranny, proving that free peoples united in common cause could overcome any form of oppression. The Battle of Normandy stands as testament to human courage in the face of overwhelming odds, strategic planning executed with precision under chaotic conditions, and the ultimate triumph of democratic values over totalitarian brutality. From the first shots fired in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6 to the final German surrender, in the Falaise pocket, the campaign demonstrated that freedom's price, however costly, was worth paying in full.